Everyone. My name is Dania Matos. I'm the Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer here at UC Merced. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you for joining us for today's session. Free Speech Week has been an exciting week. We started our journey with hate speech with Dr. Lam from the UC Center for UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, who also provided the funding for this week. Then our keynote address by President Lori White of DePaul University talked about the twin values of freedom of expression and free speech. And just yesterday, our Dean of Students, Dr. Grady, and our Grad Division Dean, Dr. Kello, walked us through navigating issues of free speech and academic freedom. And then we ended our evening yesterday with PEN America talking about free speech as a human right. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming our Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, Greg Camfield, who's going to discuss how higher education has failed to teach critical thinking in public discourse. I want to welcome all of you today. I want to let you know that this session will be recorded and that we look forward to engaging with you. We always want to ground our work in our land and labor acknowledgement. So as you engage in your work and think about the importance of the positionality of sort of the land we sit on and also the labor that allows us to enjoy certain freedoms. It reads, local indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backward, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on campus is called Scholars Lane. By day, you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity through campus community members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada. I know that may look differently in this virtual environment, but hope that you can imagine and continue to build that community and land and labor acknowledgement in the virtual space. Here are some reflection questions as we engage in the discourse throughout the day. What intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? And what is your organization, department, administrative unit, you yourself doing beyond acknowledging those whose land and labor allow you to live and work or learn on this space? I'll now turn it over to Onar Primitivo, our Director of Equity and Justice, who will walk through our community guidelines. And again, thank you for being here. We're so happy to see you.
Thank you, Danya. And as we have, some of you are returners, so welcome back. Again, thank you for coming to the virtual session today and joining us. And part of this conversation and dialogue is that being mindful and aware and practice of our community agreements. And these are what we have for the group, that we agree to speak for ourselves and allow others to speak for themselves with no pressure to represent or explain to the whole group. We agree to listen with resilience and hanging in there when something is hard to hear, grappling with multiple perspective and striving for intellectual humility. As a marketplace of idea, this is very prominent. We agree to consider and ask questions to check out our assumptions we are making rather than taking that assumption as facts. So that provocative inquiry. We agree to share airtime and participant within the suggested time frame. Again, we want to couch the conversation and hopefully continue the conversation beyond our Free Speech Week. We agree to not interrupt except to indicate that we did not or we cannot or did not hear the speaker. And again, we will be part of the dialogue is opening the chat and that we agree to pass or pass for now if we're not ready or willing to respond to a question. We agreed that when we discuss our experience with people who are not present, we will not attach names or other identifying information unless we have permission to do so. So confidentiality is critical. What is shared here stays here. What is learned here can be shared out of those lessons. And last and most important, that we agree to this. This is a space of learning, recognizing that no one, even the speaker, know all of the things. We are all in the process of learning. And the challenge here too is if you identify where your learning edges is and then push it, For example, whenever you think I already know this, ask yourself, how can I take this deeper? Or ask the question, how am I applying it in practice of what I already know? So I will also remind folks in the chat and post these community agreements, and I turn it back to Dr. Matos.
Thank you, Onar. Well, without further ado, I introduce our extraordinary Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, Greg Canfield. Round of applause. Use your Zoom reactions. There you go.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I have been giving talks at the beginning of each academic year and convocations for both faculty and staff. And this year was disrupted by the pandemic. And when the last one I gave, I was already very concerned about ways in which public discourse was being violently disrupted and how hard it was for us to have the discipline to not fall into the same traps of especially attribution errors, assuming that other people have malintents, that we had to be kinder to one another. But as time has passed, it's become clear to me that we have a lot more to do than take care of ourselves. And in particular, I found that the events of December and then January suggested that we are in the midst of a real crisis, and that higher education must play a role in recovering civic discourse. And my question is, well, why haven't we done so already? What's gone wrong? What's happened? I mean, more people are educated in colleges and universities now than ever before, and yet we're at a radical breakdown point in the way civic discourse works. I'm going to begin today by asking a favor of you. While I'm talking, I'd like you to keep track of your responses to what I'm saying. In particular, pay attention to when you feel uncomfortable. Now, that may manifest as no more than a quick desire to debate a point. Pay attention to that, please. It may be more obviously discomfort because I'm challenging some belief that is fundamental to your role as an educated person, in particular for those of you who are faculty members. Why I asked this question should become clear over the course of my talk. Now, as I say, America has a democracy deficit, and it shows very powerfully in a debased public discourse. It's easy to blame this deterioration of public discourse on ignorance, and that's a big part of what our pundits are telling us. QAnon is popular among those who are uneducated. Trump is popular among those who are uneducated. Maybe there's truth to that position, but from where I sit, it doesn't seem to really explain what's going on. The number of highly educated people using the tools of critical thinking to mount attacks on, quote, the other side, whatever that may be, while ignoring weaknesses in their own positions, suggests the cause is deeper. I could point out many politicians who fit this bill. The most recent is Josh Hawley, a graduate of Stanford and of Yale Law. It's easy to be cynical and say he's playing a zero-sum game and uses his education in a purely instrumental way. But from what I've read of him, I think he believes his own positions. I don't think he's saying just what it takes to get elected, and I don't think he's the only highly educated true believer. But if that problem statement doesn't work for you, let me try another. Consider modern anti-vaxxers, people who are crusading against vaccination. Now, I'm not talking here about communities of color that have strong, understandable reasons for skepticism about the medical establishment. I'm referring predominantly to white upper middle class folk who are active in the anti-vax movement. There was a 1998 article published in The Lancet postulating a link between the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and autism. Now, within academic discourse, that article was attacked. The credibility of the author was impugned because he had failed to reveal some conflicts of interest, and his data use was proven to be faulty. So in all the ways in which a discipline checks discourse, this article failed and it was withdrawn. It was actually withdrawn, but it was out there. And many highly educated people outside of the medical discourse community, outside of the discipline, cite that article as a reason that they have an autistic child. And they've crusaded against all vaccines because of it. Now, I speak of this as the parent of a neuroatypical child, and I understand the desire to blame someone other than me for the challenges he's faced in school and in social interaction. And I would be a normal human being if I engaged in motivated reasoning, cherry picking information that supported my desire while ignoring the easier solution closer to home. And that solution is I look at a lot of my family members and I say, this is genetic. There's no one else to blame. It's the accident of variation in the human genome. And that he doesn't fit as well in society as others is a course of pain, but it's not something to be blamed or attacked or externalized as someone else's fault. Yet I understand why someone would not like to face similar facts. And I know I have the tools to prove to myself what I want to believe. Anti-vaccination rhetoric is not just personal, it's political. It proffers an argument that minimal personal risk is not justified by substantial social benefit. And that argument is having a huge impact on our collective efforts to manage the coronavirus pandemic. I'm astonished at the motivated reasoning used against public health measures. Here's an example from Monday's Washington Post about a carefully presented, plausibly scientific assault on the COVID vaccine. And I quote, Nihariki Satha, a 34-year-old internal medicine physician in New Jersey, first heard the fertility rumor from another doctor. The friend confided that she would decline the coronavirus vaccine because of something she'd seen online, that the shot could cause the immune system to attack the placenta, potentially leading to miscarriage and infertility. Satha, who was early in her pregnancy at the time but had not told anyone, spent the next few weeks scrutinizing information from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine and calling trusted experts to investigate the report. In the end, she determined the rumor had no basis in fact, and both she and her friend wound up getting the vaccine, but the experience left her rattled. That kind of misinformation is really scary, Satha said, adding, it has enough science to sound potentially plausible. Now think of the scientific knowledge it would take to make an argument that would require substantial research by a medical professional to debunk. Now, if you doubt me on this, read the commentary after any article on vaccines in a reputable journal like the Washington Post or the New York Times or you name it. The substantial but distorted understanding of immunology, of epidemiology, and evolution is fascinating and discouraging to behold. We now have a body of psychological and neurophysiological research on motivated reasoning, but the knowledge that we believe according to our own frames of reference is old. Think of the folk wisdom in, to a hammer, all the world looks like a nail. And this is why I say higher education has contributed to the problem. We tend to create hammers. There's nothing wrong with a hammer when trying to build something, but a hammer can also smash things. It depends on where and when it's used. Now, note that we speak of graduating with a degree in a particular discipline, in which we learn the rules of critical discourse within that discipline. My discipline of literature includes hermeneutics, the study of textual interpretation, and one of the first things we learn of is the hermeneutic circle, that interpretation is not linear, but recursive. Done well, we enrich understanding with each pass, but the metaphor also includes a warning of circular reasoning to establish principles that lead interpretation to be merely an act of confirmation rather than exploration. If that is foundational to the enterprise, then why do my colleagues and I get caught in that circular reasoning so often? We have a large number of schools of interpretation, and we defend those to the end. Yeah, the other person's interpretation is an example of circular reasoning, but mine isn't. And yet my discipline works, because within the discipline, we practice a shared understanding of criticism. Since we all follow more or less the same rules of engagement, each position gets attacked through structured skepticism. Collectively, motivated reasoning is revealed and the body of acceptable knowledge expands. In other words, the best version of the hermeneutic circle is instantiated in an adversarial process, rather than asking us to internalize that recursive practice in any particular instance of interpretation. The tools we use to attack can be moved outside the discipline without the structure to hold them to account. This is true of every discipline. The disciplined skepticism of an adversarial process works only within the discipline to expand knowledge. Here are some of the general features shared by most, if not all, disciplines in the academy. Every discipline, like all human knowledge, begins with an agreement of what is given. That is, we share what facts are taught without significant proof in order to get to the interesting controversies and what basic assumptions underpin discourse. Disciplinary knowledge is no different from general knowledge in that almost everything we know by hearsay. It's the competitive advantage of our species that we can learn despite boundaries of time and space. That entails a huge weakness, however. It means that we must be unconsciously and arrogantly gullible. I really want to hang on that. We are all unconsciously and arrogantly gullible. Almost all of the facts we know, including those in each of our disciplines, is weak in the face of attack by a true Pyrrhonian skeptic, that is a total skeptic, a complete skeptic. There's no progress of knowledge if we can't have faith in the integrity of our teachers and of our colleagues. That faith within a discipline is earned because the techniques of checking error through a structured and limited skepticism gives us confidence in the collective product. Disciplines also agree on what counts as worth investigating. When Barbara McClintock wrote papers about maize genetics in which she showed that the genome in holistic interaction with the cytoplasm of each cell and the signaling of the entire organism could adapt, genetically adapt in response to stressors, her theory of jumping genes as it's come to be known. She was ignored for a long time because the then current strand of thinking about DNA as the master molecule, as Evelyn Fox Keller pointed out, under the dominant formulation of evolution by random genetic change selected for after the fact, meant that her studies just weren't part of genetics. Before she was acknowledged, she ultimately won a Nobel Prize. The field had to slightly shift its givens in order for it to pay attention to her extraordinary work. Disciplines also agree on what counts as evidence, what kinds of procedures are legitimate for finding and presenting evidence, what is a burden of proof, and what are the conditions for judgment. This includes regulation of who has the right to speak and what form presentation may take. Even though structure and style differ radically among disciplines, the one constant is that they're all structured argumentatively as part of an adversarial process. That means that each presentation is fundamentally advocacy. This is very important. Advocacy within a structured adversarial process is supposed to yield improved understanding. But what happens when advocacy escapes the bounds of an agreed upon process? Note then that a disciplinary process includes an ethical component. Questions of ownership of ideas, measurements of priority, distribution of honors are central to each discourse community. The ethics of what and how we study evolved later and more slowly. We now have human subjects restrictions that are extradisciplinary precisely because disciplines proved susceptible to horrific ethical lapses, such as in the Tuskegee syphilis studies or the Stanford prison experiment. Some important corollaries. This is a Western and masculinist construct, but it does not fully draw on the Western intellectual tradition even. Despite our understanding of the limits of positivism, our fundamental orientation in the academy to knowledge remains inflected by positivist feelings about the nature of reality. Other Western traditions, such as the Renaissance humanist interest in paradox, are relegated to historical study. And I cannot imagine trying to bring the Buddhist koan or the Taoist pu'u into our intellectual milieu. Each of these has its own educational and disciplinary tradition based on very different assumptions about the nature of reality. Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in American Life, the influential 1985 book by Robert Bella and Tipton and their research collaboration, described a stage in the deterioration of American political discourse. And one of their most important points of analysis is they talked about the rise of what they called lifestyle enclaves, especially gated communities. They felt were part of the reason for us losing a sense of a larger polity. Similar arguments have been made about the university, that we have intellectual enclaves with fences and monitored gates, and we're losing the university in the process. I wouldn't go that far. At least we tend to share the same norms of engaging in critical discourse, though the world beyond our gates does not. Our reasoning may be safe inside, but does it travel? I'd say it doesn't. The tools by which we mutually test positions within a discipline have balance through reciprocity. When they leave the confines of a discipline, they can easily become tools of confirmation, self-confirmation through attack, rather than of discourse. Is there an alternative? Yes. In fully transparent teaching that insists that students understand that all of their thinking is built on mental models. Human beings have no choice but to think through models. But if we can identify the schema we use in a particular context and interrogate our own motivations for using those schema, we can be humble about knowledge without being crippled by a total skepticism. I'm going back to medicine for a minute to make my case. In their 2004 book, Internal Bleeding, The Truth Behind America's Terrifying Epidemic of Medical Mistakes, Kava G. Sojania and Robert Wachter cite an estimate of deaths caused by medical error each year in the United States as about 100,000. That's about 3 times the number of people who die in car accidents, by the way. Their book, which is the best management book I've ever read, totally independent of its real purpose, argues that every error needs to be looked at as the unintentional consequence of a systems failure. In rare cases, true negligence and incompetence are the problem, but even those cases exist because the system was incapable of self-regulation. Under pressure from analyses like theirs, the last generation has seen a significant change in how medicine is practiced, and pertinent to my point, how it is taught. By the way, our new UC president, Michael Drake, was instrumental in improving medical training when he was at UCSF. So it's perhaps no surprise that I'm going to draw an example of what I propose from UCSF. Kristen, if you could put the link in the text box, in the chat box, I'd appreciate it. This is a video that UCSF uses to help clinician educators understand how the UCSF curriculum approaches teaching. You can look at this if you want to at your leisure. I'm going to talk through what I think is important about it. It's a performance, it's staged, it's not real. It's a performance of how a clinical educator can use metacognitive pedagogy, that is to be thinking about how you're thinking, what the assumptions you're making are, and be fully aware of those. How an educator can use a metacognitive pedagogy to help a medical trainee learn to diagnose illness. The scenario is of a trainee telling her supervisor her approach to diagnosing a patient who complains of intermittent abdominal pain. The format is highly structured and used widely in medicine, both in oral and in written forms. It's one of the classic forms of disciplinary communication. The segment we are shown is of the assessment and plan, the very structured traditional approach. It includes the problem statement that the clinician uses and points out that such a statement shows the mental model the student is using in creating a prioritized differential diagnosis and plan of response. In this case, the student suspects gallstones and proposes an ultrasound to confirm. The teacher does not correct the student's diagnosis and plan, even though it is likely wrong. Instead, she asks the student to explain her reasoning by, quote, thinking aloud why this over that, close quote. In explaining her reasoning, the student reveals that she is stuck in one possible schema for abdominal pain that is anchored in location rather than process. The instructor calls out this problem by name, quote, using an anatomical approach can lead to anchoring, close quote. That is, fixing your reasoning in one possibility and then finding confirmatory evidence rather than being open to other possibilities. By calling it out, the instructor invites the student to find another schema that might offer a different diagnosis. At that point, the student postulates angina, and the instructor asks the student to list the elements of an illness script, which they explicitly define as the mental model of a disease. Now, why is this pertinent? Because in medicine, when a hammer is looking for a nail, i.e., a gastroenterologist anchored in the abdomen is looking for biliary disease and missing atypical angina, the patient may die. And when an educated person applies her or his adversarial techniques outside the structured boundaries of the discipline, the hammer can beat rather than build things. We get rabid anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists, and an inability to listen with humility, other positions, other possibilities, other humanities. I suggest we learn from our med school colleagues and teach the mindsets of our disciplines, to learn how to recognize the cognitive shortcuts we can safely take within a discipline and to jettison them when they are beyond the safe confines of the discourse community. It's not an easy thing for us to do. We've won our disciplinary chops through hard work, and to tell students to see our facts as part of mental models that can and must be shed when they are inappropriate is to ask us to be critical not of what lies within our disciplines, but of disciplinarity itself. Please do not misunderstand me. I am not attacking expertise. I'm calling attention to the misuse of expert tools. That is, there is danger in overplaying expert techniques outside of their own realms. If we teach our students intellectual humility and suppleness, if we teach them to identify how certain schemas shape what we think is true, and if we then give them the tools to be self-critical before they engage in public discourse, would that change how they engage in public discourse? In all honesty, I don't know. But I do know that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, one of the most important organizations in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, insisted that nonviolent action could only work if people engaged in nonviolent protests after careful self-purification. I know too that the Quakers, who developed many of the practices of civil public participation and conversation, also insisted on a social process of self-reflection to identify whether one's course of action served the greater good or merely one's own ego. I'm cherry-picking evidence to support my point. And maybe the fact that I'm like all people caught in a hermeneutic circle is grounds for despair. But if that kind of self-awareness of cognitive biases and motivated reasoning can save lives in medicine, I think it's worth a try as a way of bolstering healthy civic discourse. Thank you. It is so weird giving a talk by Zoom. You don't get any of the back channel stuff about whether.
There you go, I came off mute. There you go.
All right, we've got some time. I'd love to hear your responses.
Yes, so I will be helping with facilitating your responses and questions you may have for Greg. So if you would like to share a question, please raise your hand. You can do so by going to the reactions part at the bottom of your Zoom screen and just clicking raise hand. I'd be happy to call on you to verbally share, or feel free to also add your question or comment in the chat, and I can share that on your behalf. So, are there any questions or reactions?
Sure, Colleen. I'd be happy to send titles of the books you mentioned. I'll give them to Kristen and she can figure out how to distribute them.
Great. So I see that Iris has raised her hand. So Iris, I invite you to come off mute and go ahead and share.
Hey, Iris.
Good morning, Greg. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I thought I'd go ahead and throw out the first question out there just to get a discussion going along. Let's talk a little bit about maybe the relationship in terms of talking about how disciplines are obviously epistemological structures. They are definitely embedded in Western traditions. And I think, we probably also need to talk about, and I guess I'm just going to ask you, what do you think the role of interdisciplinarity is in terms of the context of your talk, while realizing that disciplines are obviously epistemological structures? So in what way can we also account for interdisciplinary or coalitional connections between disciplines?
That's a really good question. I went to a conference hosted jointly by the NSF and the NIH on team science. And the people who had the most to offer were social scientists who talked very explicitly about the ways in which disciplinary formations were so powerful that people trying to work across disciplines often couldn't talk with one another, that they had to step way back and establish ground rules for interaction that were cross-disciplinary. And they had to start pulling out their presuppositions that were trained into their thinking from their disciplinarity. So they actually had to consciously do that kind of metacognitive work I'm talking about in order to make interdisciplinary collaborations actually productive. I think in an interesting way, it's very highly correlated to the challenges we have with cultural diversity. That you can go in with goodwill, we're going to all bring our perspectives and we're going to solve problems, but when the discourses are working from fundamentally disparate epistemologies, you can think you understand one another and you don't. You first have to excavate those presuppositions. And so, when we watch these people understanding how interdisciplinary works in team science, I mean, we're talking about trying to solve major challenges, significant human problems. And the first problem is that of culture, of really learning how to listen outside of one's presuppositions. Did you want to engage further, or should we move on to Robin?
No, I think it's a really good point, especially once you get to a certain level of education, as you said, whether it's at the bachelor's or graduate level. I think when we don't necessarily learn in interdisciplinary ways, we do kind of get caught up in our own solipsism, right? Or disciplinary solipsism, to where we're not necessarily able to engage beyond our own world. So maybe then I probably would just follow up with, what do you think then the role of an educator, pedagogically speaking, is in developing that type of aptitude?
I think first it has to be self-examination. I mean, really think about the ways in which certain presuppositions shape your thinking. One of the things I love about shared governance is that we have to work as an interdisciplinary mix on committees. And I can't tell you how much I've learned by listening to my colleagues from very different disciplines. I think that practice is very salutary. Robin?
Yeah, so I love your talk. I think you always are so elegant with your thinking and presentations. It's always such a gift. So I was just thinking, while I agree that we can get into our disciplinary silos and all, what you described, especially in terms of your discipline as the hermeneutic circle, is really part of the academic enterprise, even in our own discipline, right? We put our ideas forward through peer review or what have you. We get feedback, that some sort of inquiry or criticism or some kind of feedback that helps us just advance, take things to the next level. So all of our knowledge production is not, we might think we're sort of have this sort of fixed, I don't know, way of doing things or of thinking about the world, but it really, if we think about it, is an evolving knowledge production process for all of us. I think that's that's a useful way of thinking of hammers that only seek out nails, right? There's a way then we can hopefully see this as all very productive. I always think of, I say it so many times, like what we know about, whatever, anthropological knowledge is as best as we know right now. We're still, we've gone through different sort of evolutions where we've sort of like rethought, for example, something like the Maya, Maya civilization, and when its origins and when it was the classic period. It's been, as we learn more about and discover more, we keep changing the timelines and pushing it back. But there was periods where we all thought we were so firm on our understanding about certain knowledge based on our discipline. So what I love about, and all of us love probably about being at the university, is that it's dynamic. You learn some fundamentals, you learn some tools, and then, but you're always part of that. What's pushing the boundaries of knowledge and new knowledge. But now I want to try to think about now, okay, love all of that and get the interdisciplinary and how there still can be gaps in communicating. Now I want to think of when this knowledge is outside of the discipline and it's in the public sphere, and you have people that are not us necessarily, but people drawing on, cherry picking, like you mentioned, cherry picking knowledge to support their position. How can we get that same sense in the public sphere? What kind of tools? I love what you said, like pedagogically, to be reflecting on our own teaching and our own listening. Are those the same skills you would advocate for us in the public sphere when we're trying to challenge perhaps, evidence-supported anti-vaccination argument, right? How would you say is our best way to engage, and maybe respectfully engage, yet throw in some of these tools of the university to advance public discourse?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. I think one of the challenges we have here is that as experts, I mean, as you say, within a discipline, we have a degree of humility. I mentioned Barbara McClintock. Well, she couldn't have received the Nobel if the discipline hadn't changed. Mm-hmm. So it builds in the process for change in that disciplined, limited skepticism. So, at any given moment, if you were to attack a fundamental precept, you'd probably get a lot of pushback. But as enough people start to say, hey, wait a minute, we're wrong on that one. We need to really change how we think about what is a, quote, primitive culture, to use your discipline. That word wouldn't be used anymore, and yet it was normative in the early era. So, that kind of change happens internally, in part because we share an understanding of error and that we're trying to create a corrective process. When we take that outward, I mean, my God, the way it's misused is really frightening. So, if you say the theory of evolution, people say, oh, well, it's just a theory. We don't have to pay any attention to it. It's not proven. If we try to say, well, right now, we do not know if the corona vaccine is like vaccines usually are, going to not only prevent you from getting the disease, but preventing some percentage of people will get the disease still, and some people will not show it but can still carry the virus, but most won't do either. That's the way most vaccines work. But right now, we don't know that about these. So in good scientific fashion, we're saying we still have to be cautious. We should still be wearing masks. We should still be practicing social distancing. And what message gets out there? It doesn't work. I'm not going to take it. So there's a degree to which the kind of motivated thinking is stunningly impervious to humility, and I have no solution to that. I would hope that if we are good at helping our graduates become more attuned to the danger of motivated thinking, more people will be responsive to the kind of humility of an error bar in a statement.
I guess I wonder if I may just a little further, you kind of described the medical school process and exercise where a person's ideas were put there, and then maybe the medical student was asked to kind of interrogate a little bit the thought process. I wonder the extent to which in the public conversation or discourse that would be effective. some sort of a inquiry or follow-up, not attacking, not interrogating, not challenging, but getting someone to actually kind of walk through their decision-making a little bit, right? Or
That's really interesting. I like the way you're thinking.
I'm thinking out loud here. We need solutions, right?
That's really cool. Yeah, can you imagine a talk show that wasn't just yelling at everybody, but saying, "Talk me through your thinking"? That actually might be a lot of fun.
I mean, in a way that, kind of respects the person and
Yeah.
trying to dismantle them right there in real time.
I mean, it kind of goes back to Andrew's question in the chat. There's a tendency to believe that we're all politically monolithic, and that's used against us. Oh, why should we trust you? You're just political hacks. So maybe instead of to pronounce our positions, to reveal our thinking, I mean, maybe that would work. I love the way you're thinking, Robin.
Thinking out loud here. Thank you.
Nancy?
Thanks. This is actually kind of a follow-up to some of Robin's points. First, I want to just acknowledge that I find it fascinating that you're drawing on medical education. And just, I've always found it interesting when you do that from a sort of a more literary interpretation or humanities perspective. As someone who's trained as an anthropologist and is chair of public health, I live interdisciplinarity and have for most of my research career. And I just want to build on a couple of things you said, Greg, because, within medicine, within medical training, there was a strong turn toward what has been termed cultural competency for many years. And then there was a recognition that, whoa, that's playing into power structures, pre-existing power structures, and creating static conceptualizations of cultural practices. And what we really need to think about is cultural humility, which is the term you've been using over and over again. And I think that I often think of that term in my own teaching and my community-based work. And I draw upon, and I guess this gets to what Robin was talking about, different traditions went from the university when thinking about those engagements. So the Socratic method, Robin, that you just mentioned, really, rather than being confrontational, treating these kinds of conversations ethnographically. How can I understand where you're coming from in order to create a basis for conversation? And then also another tradition, thinking about Paulo Freire's, popular education, knowing that thinking about who holds knowledge. It's not just the university, right? It's everyone that we're engaging with, and it behooves us to figure out how to engage in a way that enables those knowledge barriers to share their knowledge, because they know what the issues are, they know what the problems are in their community. And so thinking about that with our students, giving them the power to be critical of what they're reading. I mean, that's the thing that I'm always challenged with in the classroom. So those are just some other, thoughts just to add to the conversation. Not really.
I love it. And it so fits with a couple of questions that just came up here in the chat. One about emergence, that knowledge is emergent. And if we allow it to be emergent across boundaries rather than simply within a silo, it becomes something very different. And then Yesenia's question, what's the best way for us to engage communities that have been traumatized, in part by our past practices? Well, I think we have to begin by acknowledging it. I mean, I was very explicit in this talk that this is a masculinist Western discourse. It assumes that confrontation will bring forth truth. It's a jurisprudential approach. It often works. It often fails. And there are other ways to come to knowledge. And to ask communities that have been traumatized to engage in that kind of adversarial practice is going to be off-putting. It's hostile. It is not inviting. And I think that's one of the reasons why, when I'm talking about humility, the only way to invite people in is to first say, we've really done horrible, awful things. This is a systems problem. It's like the book on medical error. We had no choice. We weren't conscious of it. It was part of a system. But by making clear what was assumed, we now have power to change the system. One of the things that I've been saying all over is I would like to start thinking of us as experts on tap rather than on top. You know, we're the experts. Listen to us. Do what we say. No, we bring some disciplined perspective for your use. Tap us. I think it's a huge perspective shift, and it's one that I hope will be salutary.
I just want to, sorry, jump in and just completely agree with that last point, because that is, I mean, that was one of the reasons why I came to UC Merced, because in the mission statement, it talks about relevance to the broader community within which we are situated. And being experts on tap means that we are a resource, but we also, I think the important piece of that is to recognize that there are so many resources out there that we can learn from as well, and that you know, can be a co-creation of possibilities.
Yeah, Andrew, you're talking about the antagonism to discourse, right? And I don't think we've done enough to instill this idea of having your mind open, that the point of discourse is to listen more than it is to talk. And I'm trying to suggest that this idea of metacognition and understanding mindsets is a tool we can use to open people to other positions. And as I said, I honestly don't know if it'll work. I think it's worth a try.
Great. And Greg, I'd like to also get some earlier comments that came in the chat, including one from Andrew. And so Andrew was wondering, do you think that universities have weakened their ability to teach critical thinking and public discourse by increasing political imbalance on campuses?
Andrew, I tried to respond to that earlier. Do you want me to say more, or do you want to speak?
I guess I would just say I have family that live in the Midwest, and they feel very unliked by the elite institutions in the country, by the news, by you know, storytelling institutions, and especially by universities. And you know, I've read some of the, you know, kind of the harsh things that university professors say that become mainstreamed by the news now. And I think that this actually contributes in large part to the anti-vaxxing, to a lot of the skepticism in experts. And we talk at the UC and at other institutions a lot about being able to show people that they can be represented in these institutions. And so we do a lot of work to try to flatten out the gender representation, the racial representation. But the research shows that the most increasing imbalance is actually political, just in terms of who professors donate to and how they self-describe in terms of their politics. And so a lot of Americans, you know, all of these things are coming out about legislatures voting to get rid of tenure at their flagship institutions, cutting funding for higher education. And in my view, this is obviously very bad. But I think it's a very natural outgrowth of a culture that is, you know, whenever the news an anchor makes a bad point, he affects the accent of a rural white person. If you turn on the channel to any late night comic, they're all making fun of the exact same people. And if you listen to kind of these really hostile, kind of untempered comments coming out of academics on their Twitter feeds and even in their academic work, it's just not that surprising to me that a lot of people have a resistance to expertise, to science. And I think that is in part reflected by the way that we don't represent them, that we make a hostile environment for people that are centrists and libertarians and conservatives and even liberals. Even I would say that it's become hostile to people like me, that I would consider myself just a true liberal. So that, I mean, that's kind of my view, and I love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I think you're right. I think it's of a piece with any kind of, as I was calling it, arrogance. You know, that the system encourages us to profess, right? So I don't think it's going to be easy for us, in part because we also, you know, we're speaking as if we're really, I framed this as us being separate from our society. And that was for rhetorical purposes, but we're not. We're as much a part of this entire milieu as everybody. And we have some tools that I would hope would mitigate some of the damage that's been done by, say, Twitter. But we're certainly not impervious by any stretch of the imagination. So, and because we're connected with our positions, then our lapses are exaggerated in importance precisely because of the importance we've claimed as experts. So it's a pretty horrible catch-22 in which we find ourselves.
But can I just say that I think our views are sometimes exaggerated in our own minds because we're not confronted with difference.
Yeah, that may very well be. You know, it's interesting. While I was thinking about this, I was thinking of, as you all probably know, my father recently passed away, and he was a naval aviator. ROTC is how he got through college. And he and people older than he who'd been in the Second World War, and people younger, slightly older than I, who'd been conscripted into the Vietnam War, all talked about how conscript military forced a kind of mixing and under pressure and understanding of difference across the nation. We now have a volunteer military, which in some ways is self-confirming of positions, right? And I don't think we have any public institution that really mixes us up. It goes back to what Bella and Tipton were talking about in Habits of the Heart, these lifestyle enclaves. We don't really mix across class lines or race lines. There are even enclaves of gender differences, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really easy to demonize what you don't know.
Great, thank you, Greg. Thank you, Andrew. It looks like we have a question from Melissa.
Hi, I just unmuted myself. My name is Melissa Bartholomew. I am a grad student at UCSB and a free speech fellow. So I'm not from your campus, so we haven't met before, but thank you for your talk.
Welcome.
And one of the thoughts I had was this idea of how we define expertise or define expertise as a university community when we're wrestling, thinking about issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the role of lived experience. And you started to get there after I said I was going to ask my question about, you said, you know, how we're not separate from society. That was the phrase you used. And so I'm just thinking Black Lives Matter movement, the way in which, you know, we see protest also on campus and solidarity movements and speakers coming, founders of Black Lives Matter. And like, you know, that's just one example, but very much in terms of thinking, you know, how perhaps the way we quantify or think about expertise and those ways have shifted over the decades, you know. So just something I was thinking about in terms of your comments. I don't know if it's a specific question, but if you had any thoughts about expertise in the university and role with the public.
There's a whole literature on expertise that's really, really interesting. And again, surprisingly, it's been used, not surprisingly, it's been used more in the medical field than elsewhere. But the Dreyfus brothers, originally looking at efforts to create artificial intelligence by trying to create, quote, expert systems. And you know, these computer scientists would go out and interview experts and say, well, how do you reason? And they wouldn't know, so they'd invent stuff post hoc. and the computer scientists tried to work that into their machines, and it didn't work, right? So that got Dreyfus and Dreyfus really thinking about expertise per se and understanding how it's a gradual move from being a dependent learner to an independent one, and an incorporation of approaches that are in a gestalt and that feel much more intuitive than reasoned. but you're supposed to be an expert, so you have to have a reason for everything you do. So then they would create these reasons after the fact. So we can actually see that we believe in that practice in how we educate graduate students compared to how we educate undergraduate students. It's much more an apprenticeship model, and it uses much more modeling and much more surrounded by the symbols of the position. And one of the things I love doing is reading the promotion documents for our faculty and how they describe the work they're doing. And one of the most delightful things I came across, and the first time I saw it, it just jumped out at me, was I want to help my students develop the intuitions of a scientist. And I thought, whoa, that is so counter to the popular idea of what scientists do and are. But I've seen that repeatedly now. So this is the idea of expertise, is something beyond mere rationality. It's really an incorporation of Gestalt, which is pretty cool when you think about it. And if we were readily acknowledging it, I think, again, it would make us simultaneously proud and humble of what we've accomplished. Because one of the things that they talk about with expertise is you reach a level of proficiency before expertise. Proficiency means you can grab a hold of any one of a number of algorithmic processes in your very large repertoire when you come across a situation that you don't know. And when you're an expert and you're in that high level of just intuitive reaction and something crosses you up, you can drop back down to another level or another level or another level. So there's that real self-consciousness of process. You can always back up. And again, I think it's when you get that, you say, wow, I'm really proud of what I can do, but I'm also proud of knowing when to be humble because I don't know what to do. I think that was something of a bird walk. I hope that answered your question.
And Greg, in the chat related to this, Stefano is asking, are there any studies whether critical thinking can be effectively learned at college age versus something that shapes how the brain develops earlier in life? And related, Iris is asking, how early in the educational system do we learn motivated reasoning?
Extremely early. I mean, watch children before they go to school. They are natural empiricists. They're always poking their noses into everything. They explore, and depending on the parental interaction, they're either encouraged in that kind of exploration or it's shut down. Generally speaking, when you get to school, it becomes much more do what you're told. And studies about schooling show that poorer schools tend to be much more authoritarian than schools in richer districts. So we even see a structure, and this goes way back. I mean, in the early 19th century, when Americans were first talking about universal public education, one of the justifications was to make a docile workforce, right? So elite education was to make leaders. A liberal education was for those who were entitled to be free, and the rest was about docility. I think we still see the vestiges of those patterns. I mean, Dewey may have had a huge impact on how we describe our education, but much less on how we actually practice it in American public education.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for sharing this talk and for everyone for attending today. I want to highlight that Maria has added a link into the chat where you can check out more of the great events for Free Speech Week. And also, please complete the feedback survey that has been added to the chat as well. Thank you again, Greg. And I want to hand this over to Maria for a final announcement.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you so much, Provost Canfield, for your fantastic talk. And as a graduate student, it was really nice to hear all these conversations going on in the background. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we conclude today's session, we're just going to do our raffle, our book giveaway, not a raffle, our our book giveaway of the ebook version of Caste, Origins of Our Discontent by Elizabeth Wilkerson, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner. And we're going to select 5 winners like we have for the other Zoom sessions that we hosted during our inaugural Free Speech Week. And this author explores how America today and throughout history has been shaped by a hidden caste system, a rigid hierarchy of human rankings. Congratulations, Paul, of using an immersive, deeply researched narrative and stories. And it's really applicable to our Free Speech Week because she points to ways that we can come together in our joint humanity instead of focusing so much on the differences that may divide us. Congrats, Cleo. So I'll run this 3 more times. And for all of you who may not win today, don't feel bad. We run this raffle for 5 lucky winners at the end of every Zoom session. And we have 2 more left for our inaugural Free Speech Week. Congrats, Iris. So if you don't win today, we encourage you to visit our other sessions and RSVP to have your name entered into our book giveaway. Oh, now we have April, congrats. And 1 more, and then I'll turn it back to Provost Camfield for final comments and we'll end today's session. Oh, and now it's, Robin, congrats. All right, so those are our 5 lucky winners. Please expect an email from me later today with just asking you for some information so we can share that ebook when it's available. And with that, I'll turn it back to Provost Camfield for any closing thoughts before we adjourn. Thank you so much.
I want to thank, first of all, Danya's whole office and organization for giving me some time in Free Speech Week. The whole event has been fantastic. A series of events has been fantastic and very valuable to us. And I'm honored to be able to participate in it. And I thank you all for your attention and your wonderful comments. And I felt really braced by the wonderful discourse that we had here. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for being here.